It's The World This Week, The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us, Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time Magazine. How are you, Vivian?
Very good, thank you.
How's your week been?
Not too bad, all
Not
things
too bad.
considered.
Okay. Has it been not too bad for France 24's Fatima Tawan?
Good, actually.
Good.
Yeah, good.
All right, we're going from not too bad to good. Let's see how France 24 Berlin correspondent Nick Spicer is on this Friday.
Sehr good. I'm fine. Thanks for asking. Everything's fine. It's been a bit busy here. Sadly busy with Corona upticks, but there you are.
We'll talk about it. All right. And we'll go as well to Newcastle. He can see Glasgow from his window. Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Where does one find World Politics Review?
At worldpoliticsreview.com. And in case you're wondering, I'm feeling great.
Okay. We were indeed. By the way, you can always catch the podcast version of The World This Week on Apple Music, Spotify, and other fine streaming services. Let's begin by saying Happy Diwali, the Hindu festival of lights, a joyous occasion. It features fireworks. But the morning after seems to have given Mother Nature a hangover with some seasonal smog thick in this Friday morning in New Delhi. The smog, a reminder that as an energy crisis grips the planet, India is revving up its coal-fired power plants.
It feels like it's coming into you. Smog is hurting the eyes too.
And Vivian Walt, for anyone who's been to India at this time of year, that's commonplace, that smog.
I actually was recalling the last time I was in India, which was this time of year, and yes, it really catches you in the throat. It's so worrying that between India and China, of course, you have two huge countries, the two most populous countries in the world, who are both still heavily reliant on coal. And until that changes, there is just no way to see how we're going to solve the climate crisis. The arithmetic simply doesn't add up.
Yeah, the talk of, you're saying China, it's where they're having to fire up as much coal as they can to keep up with a resurging world economy. Beijing also choking with smog. Its leader Xi Jinping, by the way, among the noticeable non-shows at the COP26 climate summit taking place right now in Glasgow. The locals in the Chinese capital are skeptical whether the trip would have been worth it.
I've seen in the news that there's been this meeting on climate issues. But personally, I don't think those talks will make much of a difference.
So Judah Grunstein, smog in Delhi, smog in Beijing, and all this talk about how to cut out coal.
Yeah, all this talk about how to cut out coal, but also all the other fossil fuels. I wish that there was some way to frame the Glasgow summit with some optimism. There have been some deals announced. Even the process since the Paris Agreement has remained on track. Despite the U.S. pulling out under the Trump presidency. But really, the level of ambitions of the various countries' plans has not really risen to the urgency of the crisis. And even if all the commitments at this point are fulfilled, it wouldn't really meaningfully reach the kind of net zero or reduction in emissions that we need. So I guess the best way for me to put it is that I'm of the George Carlin school of short-term pessimism and long-term optimism. I don't feel very optimistic that we'll actually achieve some of the emissions goals. But as Carlin said, everyone talks about save the planet, save the planet. He said the planet's been through a lot worse than what humans can give it. The planet will be just fine. We might not be around to see it, though.
Yeah, and by the way, this Friday was Youth Day at the summit, and the world's most famous teenage activist was front and center in Glasgow, Greta Thunberg, who pulled no punches in her speech and on Twitter. She said COP26 has been named the most excluding COP ever. This is no longer a climate conference, this is a Global North Greenwash Festival, a 2-week celebration of business as usual and blah, blah, blah. Now, Let me play devil's advocate here, Fatimata.
Yeah.
Because yes, all right, we're not expecting some, as Judah was saying, some grand announcement that's going to save the world magically in a summit, but it is forcing us to talk about it. Number one, and number two, the level of sophistication of when you compare to what it was like back in 2015 here in Paris, or 2016 here in Paris, in terms of what people are demanding is increasing. You get the sense that people are switched on as to what the problem is at hand.
They give the impression to dig more on the subject, of course, obviously. But I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a bit more like skeptical, much more like Greta Thunberg on this, because I'm really concerned about Africa, for instance, responsible for less than 4% of all, the emission of gas and everything in the world, and yet the most vulnerable continent, of the climate change. And there's no real action, no real measure taken. So this is really concerning. And given the outbreak of the coronavirus, we seemed like the humankind is keen to take action when the danger is, close and immediate. And they give the sense that climate change is something very far away. We're not all concerned by that. And until that, sense of reality change, and I'm not really, I'm more skeptical, about the outcome of this kind of global change climate conference.
Yeah, you mentioned Africa, the negotiations in Glasgow, all about financing energy transition for the developing world so it doesn't have to ramp up fossil fuels, but go straight to renewables. South Africa's president, among those perfectly willing to phase out coal. The question, says Cyril Ramaphosa, is how?
Achieving these targets will require the transformation of our energy system at an unprecedented speed and scale. This will include the decommissioning, the repowering, and the repurposing of coal-fired power stations and the rollout of renewable energy. But our ability to do so will be determined by the extent of support that we receive from developed economies.
Nick Spicer, it seems a little abstract, right, when we talk about financing. When you listen, though, to South Africa's president, what are your thoughts on how to make it real? You're not hearing us, are you, Nick, in Berlin? We're going to try to fix that right away and get back to you.
Oh, sorry. You
did hear me. Okay,
I can hear you.
Go ahead.
I just didn't hear my name. I apologize. I'm here. I apologize. I was listening very carefully, and how to make it real. I mean, you've got to accept that we live in a capitalist global economy, and make people interested in making money off a green revolution. And Mark Carney, who is the former Bank of Canada and the former governor of the Bank of Canada, the former governor of the Bank of England, says he has put together a group of investors and hedge funds and so on that have trillions and trillions of dollars to invest in this kind of transformation. I think that has to be part of the conversation. It's not just the stick. There's got to be some carrot as well. And certainly in Germany, which has undergone an energy U-turn, as it's called here, after the Fukushima disaster, saw a flourishing of green industries, the turn to windmills, the turn to solar power. We still have brown coal, which is a problem, but at least they're working their way through it. So I think what part of the answer when they're talking about financing is not just asking for bailouts, but recognizing or finding ways, perhaps even legislative, to incentivize companies to invest in what is not just something we have to do to save the planet, but is also an opportunity, an economic opportunity and a way to make money.
Is that how you read the message of South Africa's president, Vivian Walt?
I mean, yes. The really worrying thing is that what Ramaphosa is saying is really what he was saying a few years ago. And if you cast your mind back to the Paris climate talks 2015, exactly 6 years ago, where every single country came with their blueprint of what they would do. Now, 6 years on, we were supposed to not be speaking in these abstract terms. We were supposed to be way ahead. And the problem is we've lost several years. There are obviously optimistic things. One very optimistic thing is that investors themselves are turning against fossil fuels by the millions, and certainly against coal. Coal is a terrible investment now. And you have investors putting money into renewables because they make great money.
Yeah.
And that will increasingly become the situation. The really, really difficult thing to wrap one's head around is that we've run out of time or running out of time. And I think that's what's so scary to so many people. It's so overwhelming. And why you have this unprecedented move of kids taking to the street on a global issue, which you really never did before in, decades, generations, maybe.
Yeah, we're heading towards a French presidential election where the front runner is the incumbent. And on the one hand, he's talking about making the planet great again. But on the other hand, talking about growth. Can you have both?
Yeah, can we have both? I don't know, actually, because I'm really concerned about the fact as well that the renewable, energy should be a new greenwash, somehow, and a new escape for the old capitalism and the way to, they go more on this, and we don't know what, because we don't know actually if that's all the renewable thing with, the solar cars and all the stuff, how green are they, really for the planet? We don't know yet. And the way of everybody, rushing out in it, it's a bit scary, because we don't know everything that's going ahead. So I'm a bit concerned about that. I'm not really sure that it's going to be a really turnout, for us.
Karl Marx believed that material necessities and class interests determine the course of history, not individuals. But did the 19th century philosopher factor in Joe Manchin on this one? With a 50-50 split in the U.S. Senate, the fate of Joe Biden's energy transition plan seemed to rest in the hands of one West Virginian, a conservative Democratic senator with a personal stake in the coal industry.
To supporting a final bill that helps move our country forward, but I'm equally open to voting against a bill that hurts our country. And I've been very clear about that also.
Judah Grunstein, does the fate of the planet rest in the hands of Joe Manchin?
I get the Marxism question. No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't put it in those terms. I think that everything that we've discussed so far, including my attempt at humor to open the show, is really illustrates the complexity and the difficulty of addressing a crisis that everyone agrees is here, or most people agree is here. And it's not a crisis that's down the line, whether in Africa or elsewhere. We saw in Europe with the flooding this summer. We saw in North America with the heat waves. And wildfires. The crisis is now. The emergency is now. We know that, and yet at the same time, as everyone has said, since Paris, or even for that matter, if you go back to Copenhagen, the sophistication in the analysis and the sophistication in terms of the general public's understanding of the issues and what needs to be done has accelerated dramatically. But the actual commitments of the sectors that need to do things, and that's government, that's the fossil fuel industry, the private sector, hasn't kept pace. So where does Joe Manchin fit in? Joe Manchin might be an individual, but he's an individual that represents a sector and a class. And it's not just the fossil fuel industry. There are workers in his state who depend on the coal industry for their jobs. They've been failed because we haven't really tackled the question of how you actually get people from jobs in these polluting industries into jobs in cleaner industries or alternative industries. They've been, in a sense, left behind. And that's just West Virginia. If you look around the world, there are other people too. This question of climate justice. We mentioned China, India, and as emitters, and Africa and African countries as non-emitters. All those countries are still very much in the middle or beginning of their development paths compared to the advanced industrial economies, and in terms of their populations. And we're asking them right now. All of a sudden it's like, okay, well, sorry, you just can't do that. And not only that, we're not going to pony up the money to help you leapfrog the fossil fuel phase of development to get to a clean development. So all these individuals and all these groups and populations are put in a situation where even if they would like to be part of the solution, we're making it collectively very difficult for everyone to be part of the solution. That includes young people. We just a final wrap up. We just included a columnist, Aishwarya Machani, who's a future fellow, a next generation fellow at the United Nations Foundation. And the topic of her column is intergenerational justice, and in terms of climate in particular, but also other things. These are young people who have very clear ideas of what's necessary, and they're often not included in the negotiating rooms. Their views aren't taken into account. They too are left out of this discussion. So I think that the big failure is how to get on board all these groups and individuals who maybe Joe Manchin represents some of them. Maybe there was a way to do it so that Joe Manchin could have said, yeah, this is great for my state. A green energy transformation is great for my state. Let's do it. And so I think there are some collective failures as well that have made it harder for people to come on board with the solution as opposed to the problem.
Nick Spicer, the same problem where you are in Germany as partners try to form a new coalition that includes the Greens, and the country tries now to phase out coal?
Yeah, I think we'll see an acceleration of the move away from coal. The Greens are very likely going to be in the next coalition government, which could be formed as early, as the end of this month, and they want to accelerate. Germany's moving away from brown coal, which is the most polluting kind. And I think they're taking in hand the need to retrain the workers. There's only a few thousand coal miners in Germany. It's not really a big thing, but it's become this sort of third rail for a whole bunch of reasons. And of course, there's another, the energy situation is complicated because, you take away the coal, so maybe we need more gas, and that's Nord Stream 2. That's that Russian pipeline coming in, which is controversial in itself. So Germany doesn't have a lot of easy choices, decided to abandon nuclear. So it's got wind and solar. The wind energy is in the north of the country. It needs to get to the south of the country where the automakers make the Mercedes and so on. But certainly, one thing, we're talking about things that change history. You remember the butterfly effect, some little thing causing huge consequences elsewhere. Well, one little thing, not really so little, was the horrible floods in Western Germany this summer really focused the minds of people on the need to save the planet. The people made this cause and effect relation in their mind when they went to the polls, which really helped the Greens and their agenda move up, on the task list of what the next German government will do. So I think I can see, we can safely say Germany will get a lot greener than it has been in the past. Although, under Angela Merkel, it did make that energy U-turn. And I think the ambition of the Greens, who will be a lead player in the party, is to be an example to other countries too of a successful transformation.
All right, there's the climate emergency and there's the global COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, the mayor of Los Angeles experiencing both firsthand, testing positive for coronavirus while attending the COP26 summit. Eric Garcetti self-isolating in Glasgow before he returns home. Garcetti, who's fully vaccinated, is, quote, feeling good, he says on his Twitter feed. Where it's deadly serious, though, is right here in Europe right now, where the World Health Organization warns of an additional 500,000 deaths by February if citizens don't get their jabs. Hardest hit among EU nations are the ones with the lowest vaccination rates. At the county hospital in Buzău, Romania, intensive care units are so overrun that patients are being given oxygen in their cars in the hospital parking lot.
I've been here with my mother since yesterday. She's connected to oxygen. We spent the night in our car. We no longer have gas. At home, I treated her for 6 days. She was stubborn and she now regrets not getting vaccinated.
We don't know what caused COVID, but what's causing this latest wave for certain seems to be those who don't want to get their jabs.
Absolutely. And I think that's completely obvious. The German health minister, Jens Spahn, correct me, Nick, if I'm mispronouncing his name, but he put it perfectly this week. He said, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, and you go into any ICU in any hospital, whether we're talking about Romania or France, and those suffering from COVID in the ICUs are not vaccinated. They have not been for months. The vaccines that are available are extraordinarily effective. And I think for that reason, we're looking at two different realities here. Yes, there might be 500,000 more deaths by February in Europe, quote unquote, but Europe is not a monolithic place. And when you're talking about the big, rich Western European countries like Italy, France, Spain, the UK, they will not see anything like a major crisis this winter. Nobody expects one. There's a very high rate of vaccination, certainly in France and Italy. And there are parts of Germany that are really suffering. Le Monde today had a very interesting piece out of Saxony in which they went around and spoke to local folks. And there's tremendous anti-vax sentiment there. And that is the state that is most affected.
Yeah, let's talk about that. It's as Vivian says, not just Eastern Europe. The number of patients in intensive care units soaring in places like Belgium and Germany, a nation touted as a model of a smart public health policy when the COVID pandemic first spread. Here you see the graph that shows how many per 100,000 people are in intensive care units in various Western European countries. When it comes to vaccination, Germany far behind the likes of Italy and France. And as this map shows, again, Nick Spicer, it's the former East Germany where those vaccine skeptics Viv was talking about seem to abound.
Yeah, and I think, you can pretty easily draw a map where you see where there's vaccine skepticism, and it will match identically places where there was communism until the end of the
So what is it?
the Cold War.
What is it, Nick? Is it let me ask you this: Is this distrust of authority, distrust of the science, some kind of culture war? What's it about?
Yes. Has nothing to do with Karl Marx, although we've been talking about him, but it has to do with people who were governed by governments they didn't believe in for decades. They don't trust, not young people, but there is a generation that's still there, and there's a sort of thought pattern of just not trusting authorities, thinking the government is always lying, is always getting you to do something that isn't in your interest. And when the government says this is good for you, you need an injection. People, not all people, but a good number of people. And we're talking about what is the critical mass. We want to go from like 50 to 70. And if you've even got 20% of the people who are skeptical, then that changes the situation for the entire country, unless you start locking down regional, lander here. So it really is that, I think, to a large extent. You look at the Querdenker, the lateral thinker movements, they're there as well. It's interesting to note that, these are the regions also where the far right does particularly well, where people vote against migrants that actually don't come to their part of Germany. So they're perhaps maybe don't have the democratic reflexes or the empirical mindset that voters in other democracies have. They're perhaps more fearful and definitely more distrustful.
But Nick, it's been 30 years since reunification.
Yeah, I know. I'm not in their heads. I'm just repeating the numbers, and you just got to look at the map, and that's the way it is. And I mean, it's a thought habit, if you will, and it actually what is saddest is, of course, it affects the older people who lived under communism the most, and they are quite obviously the most vulnerable to COVID, and that's why the numbers there would be high.
Yeah, on Wednesday, the health minister in Germany was asked about whether to force caregivers to get their jabs. Jens Spahn, who, had to equivocate.
My concern is, when we start mandatory vaccinations in these professions, that they will not get vaccinated, but will just leave. When 50% of the caregivers say, well, then I'm off, we have a problem.
Fatima Taiwan, your reaction?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, they need more people to work there. So how can you threaten people like this? It's kind of crazy. It's the same thing in France. I mean, it's always the crisis of authority. You know, it's not only. I think we are misleading people if we just say it's on people.
But we
who
had
don't
all these
believe
people
it.
saying, "Oh, they're going to quit if you force them to get their jabs," and they didn't, for the most part.
Yeah, they didn't. But what if they did? I mean, we don't know. I mean, you can't take that kind of. It's irresponsible. I mean, for the authority to, you have to. It should be other ways to handle this kind of situation rather than just sending threats. I mean,
Judah Grunstein, I know in your native New York this past week, there was firemen and policemen forced to show their proof of vaccination, and some saying they wouldn't go to work. There were those who called in sick. There were some who there was pushback. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, but the final number of I think policemen who actually left on the day of the mandate was something like 35, or certainly less than 100. There's something very, maybe almost uncomfortable for anyone who really believes in democracy and believes in free will and the rational actor. Vaccine mandates are really effective. They work. People do them. Just as an anecdotal illustration, my 20-year-old son finally got vaccinated when he realized he wasn't going to be able to go out with his friends to cafes in Paris anymore if he didn't. They work. Not only do they work, but Frida Giddis in her weekly column this week wrote about how the far-right parties in Europe have really, they sort of embraced the anti-vaccine mandate movements, thinking that it would put some wind in their sails, similar to anti-immigration, for instance, and it hasn't. It hasn't been a successful tactic. So there is a small minority that opposes the vaccine mandates. There are people that don't get them, and they're concentrated in those parts of Europe, especially, and the U.S., where there's a latent distrust of government. And I think, in fairness, it has to be said, that's understandable in the sense that even in the absence of something as urgent as this health crisis, I think anyone would be uncomfortable with the kind of power that democratic governments, to say nothing of authoritarian governments, but democratic governments seized for themselves. And we justify it because of the health crisis, for sure. But in some cases, in Spain and the UK, for instance, there have been legal challenges to some of the authority that those governments took because they were unconstitutional. And so even in democracies where there were ways of having the popular will, or ways of having democratic oversight of some of these powers, that wasn't respected. So this entire health crisis for about a year and a half has been a real test for democracy and for the idea of that governments can't just mandate and be authoritarian. At the same time, the mandates work, and they keep people from overwhelming hospitals and from infecting other vulnerable people. So I think it's important to recognize that there is a real tension there, and that for people and populations that have a real deep-seated latent distrust of government, it's understandable, their resistance.
Understandable.
That's not to say I agree with it, but I'm saying I understand it, and we have to try to find a way to work around it.
All right. The one of the other big topics
Can I jump in?
we're going to mention quickly here is what's unfolding fast in Ethiopia. For the first anniversary of the civil war in the northern Tigray region, the rebels announcing that they teamed up with Oromo militias and were launching an offensive to take the capital. The government of Abiy Ahmed countering with a state of emergency this week.
Ethiopia will not collapse. Ethiopia will prosper. Ethiopia will exist forever.
Fatima Tawan, I know you'll be probably leading with this when you present the African news bulletin in French later.
Yeah.
The U.S. advising its citizens to leave. There's other factions that are joining this rebel alliance, similar to the rebel alliance that brought down the Mengistu regime 3 decades ago. Where's this all going?
We don't know. The question is, what are the options left to Abiy Ahmed, the prime minister? There's 2 ways. Whether he pursue wars, and there are like 9 rebels union joined forces to take the capital. You just mentioned it there. They have been, and they're moving very fast, so
government dismisses it all as a publicity stunt. Saying
it's not. They are really close. And so whether he pursue wars and, try to win it, which is not obvious at all, whether he try peace and, to fit the fact that he won a Peace Nobel Prize, I just want to mention it, and then maybe try to negotiate, with the rebels, and maybe he could save his, position as a prime minister, which is not sure at all. But there's 2 kind of options that left to him, so he have to choose.
It doesn't look like either side wants to choose peace at this point.
Exactly.
There's so much vitriol, and the rhetoric is so ratcheted up, Vivian Ward.
Indeed. I mean, the vitriol was so vicious on the part of Abiy Ahmed that Facebook even took down his remarks.
Yeah.
It just seems like on both sides, where clearly there have been atrocities on both sides, there has been no move at all towards reconciliation, and they seem determined to simply move towards this kind of horrible denouement of the crisis, which we, are, I guess, expecting any day now.
Yeah.
And we're seeing outside pressure, very briefly on this, Judah Grunstein, this international pressure that they're trying to bring to get people to come to the table. But again, if you don't want to sit down and talk, how does it work?
Well, there's that. There's also the fact that the United States' position in the entire region has been really undermined in recent weeks by the situation in Sudan, where there was a military coup almost while the U.S. envoy to the region's plane was almost still on the tarmac. After he visited, tried to get and got assurances that there wouldn't be a military coup, and almost before his plane was off the tarmac, there was the coup was launched. So the U.S.'s sort of prestige or gravitas, if you will, is pretty significantly undermined. There's also the fact that Ethiopia has a pretty long-standing history of resisting outside pressure and insisting that on its sovereign rights and its sovereign independence. And sadly, in this case, it has been in the pursuit of this war. I guess really briefly, but my final thoughts are that I looked over our coverage at WPR of Ethiopia over the course of the last 2-3 years. And there's this real tragic arc for Abiy's time in office, where there's the hope and the role of conciliator, the Peace Prize, and everything with regard to Eritrea. But within the country, it was pretty obvious pretty early on that he was heading toward a path that was going to lead to at least confrontation with the TPLF, if not war. And at a point where he possibly could have still opted for negotiation, he very clearly chose war, thinking that it would be a cakewalk. and it wasn't. I still think at this point that neither side has the strength to impose its will on the other, and that there will be, if there is continued fighting, it will ultimately be a very bloody and costly standoff. At which point it will have to be negotiated. But the question is whether they're willing to do that now before that's sort of proven by the stalemate.
Yeah, we'll have more on this, of course, as it develops. Before we go, they're selling like hotcakes in Dakar. Culture vultures descending on the Senegalese capital's Four Winds bookstore, for instance, to get their copy of The Most Secret Memory of Men. That's the book that is the 2021 winner of France's most prestigious literary prize, the Goncourt. At the ripe old age of 31, its author, Mohamed Mbougar Sarr, becoming the first sub-Saharan African winner of that prize.
I believe that today the Goncourt Academy is sending a very strong signal, I think, to many people. First of all, to the French literary world, of course, but also to the literary world in the French-speaking world.
So, Fatima Tawane, English-speaking authors from around the world who get the top prize, and we're going to mention one who won the next day in a moment. That's nothing new. For the French, though, there is this feeling of surprise whenever it's a non-French person who wins a literary prize in French.
Yeah, because it's not often that it happens. Of course, this is the first sub-Saharan to win the prize, so obviously it's a huge thing. And let me mention a few words about him. I mean, he's 31. He's not the youngest, but one of the youngest, to win the prize. He is young, smart, amazingly talented, born in Dakar, raised in in a small town called Diourbel. I remember what struck me, about him the first time I met him was this wit. I mean, he was so young and brilliant. I mean, sense of humor, and still very polite young man, very, very polite young man.
He seemed to have a lot of poise.
Yeah, he has a poise. I mean, when you know him personally, he's not that poisy. He's a bit of, but he reminds me of a character of, of coming straight from a novel of Balzac, decent man, decent boy from the outskirts who came to the town, the capital, and won it all.
Wrote his first novel at age 20, you said.
Yeah, at 20, through work, passion, and without losing his honesty, because he's still honest. And I want to mention two words about the other books that he did before. The first one was about terrorism in Mali, and the bad guy is not who you think would be, So very unconventional.
All right.
And
no spoilers, please.
Yeah, the second one was about immigration in Italy, and he was interesting in the perspective of Italian people staying there and receiving that immigrants, which is not easy. And the third one was about homosexuality in Senegal, which is heavy. We don't have to mention it. He wasn't able to do to talk about this book at the time when it was launched. So.
All right, so a wide palette and a well-earned prize, the British equivalent of the Goncourt, as we said, also going to an African. Damon Galgut taking the Booker Prize this week for his novel The Promise, which chronicles through the period through the end of apartheid for 4 decades in the life of South Africa.
This has been a great year for African writing, and I'd like to accept this on behalf of all the stories told and untold, the writers heard and unheard from the remarkable continent that I'm part of. Please keep listening to us. There's a lot more to come.
Now, Vivian Walt, this puts Damon Galgut in the same pantheon as the likes of Coetzee and Nadine Gordimer. Still, listening to what Fatimata was saying about how, this is like these works now are reaching beyond a national audience in today's world.
Absolutely. I mean, South Africa and indeed Africa, but let's just talk about South Africa, which is a country I was born and raised in. The history is heart-wrenching and dramatic, and the stories are endless. One always gets the sense there that no matter who you speak to, everybody has a dramatic story to tell. And so, yes, the country's been turning out a series of very big authors. Andre Brink, another one that you could mention. But it's not just Senegal and South Africa. Remember the Nobel Prize for Literature this year, won by a Tanzanian. I think people are finally discovering a whole world of stories, untapped stories, and it's long overdue.
Do you get the sense, Nick Spicer, that the world is more open to hearing stories from other places? And is there, dare I say it, a kind of a Netflix effect? We saw with Squid Games recently how suddenly people are signing up to learn Korean because they enjoyed the series so much. Do you get the sense that people are more open to reading books from other places, to watching TV shows and movies from other places?
Yeah, I think that's the case. And I mean, what I find sort of interesting about these cases where, the Empire Strikes Back, we have an African, being recognized in what the French would call a métropole in Paris, and similarly London bestowing a prize on an African. That's all fine. It's, to my mind, it's quasi-colonial, and there's a vast debate on the internet. If you're on like Goodreads, you could, all kinds of people talking about their reading experiences. They can't give a cash prize, but there is, you're completely right, a global debate which is taking place on the internet, not in the cafes of Paris. It's not under the glare of the TV cameras, and that's fascinating. I just found this really interesting thing called Book Talk, which is on TikTok. It's basically a lot of young women talking about books, and it's a new way for authors to promote their books. So there's a discussion there. As for Squid Games, yeah, but I mean, Netflix is, I think, the great equalizer, because you can just tune in from anywhere in the world and select what you like. And so it is doesn't need a mediation of a publishing house or some Paris or London to say this is important. There's a radical empowerment of the consumer of cultural products who just says, I like this. And so, yeah, I think we are listening to each other's stories more and more, and it goes beyond the literary prizes that that we all pay attention to, and that it is great, and we'd all love to win a Nobel Prize, but it's not the only game in town, is what I'm trying to say.
All right, so much out there to sample. Many thanks, Nick Spicer. I want to thank as well Judah Grunstein for being with us from Newcastle, Fatima Tawan, Vivian Walt. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.